two men walked into a city at sunset. By sunrise, the city was gone, not abandoned, not conquered, erased. Fire fell from the sky. Stone melted into glass. An entire valley turned to ash and salt. And in the middle of it all, one man ran for his life, while his wife turned to look back and never moved again. The valley was green. Lot stood on the ridge beside Abraham, looking down at the land stretched before them like an open hand. Rivers cutting through dark soil, trees heavy with fruit, grass so thick it could hide a man, and rising from the center, the cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, Zor. 5 cities built on trade routes where gold changed hands and merchants grew fat on deals made by sunset. Abraham's voice was quiet. Pick a direction. The land is big enough for both of us. Lot's eyes moved east. He saw opportunity, security, a future for his daughters. Abraham's hills were empty. Safe, but empty. The valley offered more. I'll take the east, Lot said. Abraham nodded, didn't argue, just watched as Lot walked down into the green. The city swallowed him slowly. First, Lot pitched his tents near Sodom, close enough to trade, far enough to feel clean. But the gravity pulled. Within a year, his tents were inside the gates. Within 2, he was sitting with the elders, a man of influence now. He had a stone house, a courtyard. His daughters had suitors, everything he'd wanted. But at night, the city changed its skin. Voices in the alleys, not conversation, something else, laughter like breaking glass, footsteps that stopped outside doors and waited. Lot would lie awake, listening to sounds he couldn't name and didn't want to. His wife stopped going out after dark. His daughters walked with their eyes down, and Lot learned to close his ears, to focus on the prosperity, the opportunity. 2 Peter called him tormented in his righteous soul day after day by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. Not angry, not righteous, tormented, like a man watching himself drown and doing nothing to swim, because leaving meant losing everything. So he stayed. The city grew richer. Caravans arrived daily. Sodom became a name spoken in distant lands with awe. But Ezekiel would later name the rot clearly. Pride, excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Lot saw it. Beggars turned away at the gates. Orphans ignored. Widows mocked. Abundance turned inward, choking on itself. He watched a man strike a beggar in broad daylight, watched the crowd laugh, watched the beggar crawl away. Lot opened his mouth, then closed it. What could one man do against a city? But someone was counting. Far above the valley, beyond the smoke of Sodom's altars, a record was being kept. Every act, every choice, every moment cruelty was chosen over mercy. Genesis says it simply. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave. Outcry, like a scream that reached past the clouds and demanded an answer. And heaven heard. Lot sat at the city gate one evening, watching the sun sink red behind the hills, his mind elsewhere, thinking about Abraham, about the quiet he used to know. He didn't notice the shadows lengthening too fast, didn't notice the air getting heavier, didn't notice the birds going silent, but something inside him stirred, like standing too close to a cliff. He looked up and saw 2 men walking toward the gate. They walked like they'd come from somewhere far. No baggage, no servants, just 2 men, but the way they moved, like the ground remembered them. When their eyes met his, Lot's breath caught. He stood, didn't know why, but every nerve screamed one word: run, not away, toward. Please, Lot said, voice tight. My lords, Turn aside to your servant's house. Spend the night." The two men looked at him, looked into him, and Lot understood. They hadn't come for trade. They hadn't come for rest. They'd come to see. They entered the city as the last light died. Lot led them through narrow streets, past houses with bolted doors, past windows where lamplight flickered and died. His hand shook as he pushed open the gate to his courtyard. "Wash your feet," he said. "I'll prepare food." The two men said nothing, just stood there, dust falling from their sandals, eyes scanning the walls like they were reading something written in the stone. Lot's wife brought water, bread, a simple meal. The men ate in silence while Lot watched them, that strange tightness still wrapped around his chest. He wanted to ask where they'd come from, wanted to ask why they looked at him like they already knew every choice he'd ever made. But before he could speak, the knock came. Not a polite knock, a fist, then another, then voices. "Lot!" someone shouted from the street. "We know you have visitors. Send them out." Lot's blood went cold. He stood slowly, walked to the door, pressed his hand against the wood. Outside, he could hear them gathering. Not 2 or 3, dozens, maybe more. Voices layered over voices, rising like a wave. He cracked the door open, just enough to see. The street was full. Young men, old men, faces he recognized from the marketplace, from the gate. All of them staring at his house with eyes that didn't look human anymore. Lot knew what they intended. He'd heard the stories, seen what happened to strangers who arrived alone in this city. Violence disguised as hospitality, cruelty normalized, and he'd done nothing to stop it. "Please, brothers," Lot said, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. His voice was shaking. "Don't do this." The crowd pressed closer. Lot's mind raced. He said something, offered something, desperate words trying to redirect their attention. Anything to protect the two men inside. But the crowd wasn't interested in negotiation. "You came here as a foreigner," someone spat, "and now you want to play judge? Get out of the way, Lot." They surged forward. Lot backed against the door, hands raised, knowing it was over. This was Sodom. This was what he'd chosen, what he'd lived with, what he'd told himself wasn't his problem. And now it was at his door. The door opened behind him. Hands, strong, impossibly strong, grabbed Lot by the shoulders and yanked him inside. The door slammed shut. Lot stumbled, hit the floor, looked up, and saw the two men standing in the doorway. Their faces hadn't changed. Still calm, still unreadable. But their eyes, outside the shouting stopped, replaced by confused murmurs. Then cries, then panic. "I can't see!" someone yelled. "Where's the door? Where?" "My eyes!" Chaos. Men stumbling into each other, clawing at their faces, crashing into walls. The mob that had been seconds away from breaking down the door scattered like leaves. Lot sat on the floor, breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at the two men who still stood there like nothing had happened. One of them turned, looked down at him. "Do you have anyone else here?" the man asked. His voice was flat, final. "Sons, daughters, anyone in the city who belongs to you, get them out." Lot's throat closed. "We are about to destroy this place. The outcry has become so great that we have been sent to end it. Destroy, not punish, not warn, destroy." Lot tried to speak, couldn't. The room felt too small, too hot. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just heard, what he'd just seen. "My sons-in-law," he finally managed. "I have to tell them." "Go," the man said. Lot stumbled to his feet out the door, into streets now empty except for blind men still groping their way home. He ran to his sons-in-law, found them laughing over wine. "Get up," Lot gasped. "Get your wives. We have to leave now. This place is going to be destroyed." They stared at him. Then one smiled. "You're joking." "I'm not." "Lot, go home. You've been in the sun too long." Laughter. Full mocking laughter. Lot stood there, chest heaving, looking at men who were about to marry his daughters, and saw nothing but contempt. He left, walked back through the silent streets, and realized with sickness that went to his bones, they hadn't come to save the city. They'd come to count the righteous, and the count was almost done. Dawn was close. Lot sat in the corner of his house, back against cold stone, watching the two men who hadn't moved since he returned. They stood near the door like statues. No exhaustion, no impatience, just waiting. His wife and daughters huddled together across the room, silent. They'd seen the mob, heard the screaming, watched their father come back alone, pale as death, muttering about destruction. They didn't believe him, but they saw what happened at the door, and that was enough to keep them quiet. One of the angels turned his head, looked directly at Lot. "When morning comes, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." Punished. The word hung in the air like smoke. Lot's mouth was dry. "What did you see?" The question came out before he could stop it, but he had to know, had to understand what tipped the scale. What made heaven decide that Sodom, wealthy, powerful, thriving Sodom, had to be erased? The angel's expression didn't change, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. Everything. Genesis doesn't give details, doesn't list the crimes one by one, just says the outcry was great and the sin was grave. But Ezekiel filled in the gaps centuries later. Pride, abundance, ease. And in all that wealth, not one hand reached down to help the broken. The angels had walked these streets before Lot ever saw them. Moved through the markets, watched transactions, saw how the strong crushed the weak and called it progress. How the rich locked their gates while beggars died outside. How cruelty dressed up as entertainment while the crowd cheered. They saw parents sell children for profit, courts twist justice for bribes, laughter drown out the cries of those who had no voice, and somewhere in the unseen ledger, the count had been kept. Not looking for reasons to destroy, looking for reasons to stop, searching for 10 righteous, then 5, then 1. Sodom had made its choice, and now heaven was making its response. "Is there no one else?" Lot asked. His voice cracked. "The whole city! Surely someone—" The angel looked at him, really looked, and in that gaze, Lot saw pity. "You stayed here for years," the angel said quietly. "You sat at the gate, made deals, built a life. In all that time, did you find even one who would stand with you against the darkness?" Lot opened his mouth, closed it, because the answer was no. He hadn't found anyone, hadn't even looked. He'd been too busy protecting what he had, too busy fitting in. Abraham had pleaded for this city once, stood before God and bargained for the lives of strangers. What if there are 50 righteous, 40, 30, 20, 10? And God had agreed. For 10, the city would be spared. But Lot hadn't pleaded, hadn't searched, hadn't fought. He'd just endured. And now, with the sun about to rise and judgment about to fall, he realized what that endurance had cost. "Why me?" Lot whispered. "Why save me?" The angel's face softened, just slightly. Abraham, one word, but it carried everything. Abraham, who'd interceded, who'd prayed, who'd stood in the gap when Lot didn't even know he needed someone to. Grace wasn't earned, it was given, extended, even to a man who'd made every wrong choice and learned to live with the consequences. But grace had limits. It could pull you out, drag you from the flames, save your body, but it couldn't make you leave what you loved. That you had to choose. The angel stepped closer. Get up, Lot. Take your family and go, now. Lot stood, legs shaking. He turned to his wife, his daughters. We're leaving. His wife's eyes widened. Now, before sunrise, where will we? We're leaving, Lot repeated, voice firmer now, almost desperate. Get whatever you can carry. Minutes, maybe less. His daughters moved, slowly, reluctantly, grabbing shawls, jewelry, bread wrapped in cloth. Small things, things that meant something in a life they thought would continue. Lot's wife stood frozen, staring at the walls, at the courtyard, at the home she'd built. We can't just... We have to, Lot said. But even as he said it, he felt the pull, the weight of everything he was about to leave behind. His house, his position, his name. Years of work reduced to nothing in the span of a single night. He looked at the angel. Where do we go? The mountains. Run and don't look back. Don't look back. 3 words, simple, clear. But Lot already knew they were the hardest command he'd ever been given. Because looking back wasn't just about turning your head, it was about where your heart still lived. And his heart was still in Sodom. Genesis 19:16 says it with brutal honesty. He hesitated. The sun was rising. The angels were at the door. His wife and daughters stood ready, clutching their belongings. And Lot stood there. Feet planted, eyes moving from the door to the walls to the courtyard he'd built with his own hands. He hesitated, not because he didn't believe them. He'd seen what they could do, seen the mob struck blind with a gesture, heard the finality in their voices when they said the word destroy. He hesitated because leaving meant losing everything he'd become. In Abraham's camp, he'd been a nephew, a follower, a man in someone else's shadow. But here he was Lot, a name spoken with respect at the city gate, a man who'd built wealth from nothing, who'd survived in a place that ate the weak and rewarded the strong. Walking out that door meant going back to being nobody, and some part of him, the part that had chosen the green valley over the empty hills, couldn't do it. The angel's hand closed around his wrist, not gentle, not patient, a grip like iron. Move. The second angel took his wife's arm, his daughter's, and they were dragged, literally dragged out the door, into the street toward the city gate. Lot stumbled, feet catching on stones, looking back over his shoulder at the house disappearing behind him. The courtyard, the gate, the life he'd spent years building. Wait, he gasped. My sons-in-law. Maybe they changed their minds. Maybe if I go back. The angel didn't slow. They made their choice, but they made their choice. The words hit like a fist, final, irreversible. Lot thought of the men he'd tried to warn, the laughter in their eyes, the contempt, and realized with sickening clarity that some people would rather die in comfort than live in uncertainty. His sons-in-law had chosen Sodom, and Sodom had chosen them. They reached the gate as the first light broke over the eastern hills. The angel released Lot's wrist, stepped back. Flee for your lives. Don't look behind you. Don't stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away. The mountains. Lot looked at the jagged peaks in the distance. Barren, empty. No cities, no walls, no gates where a man could sit and be somebody. Just rock and sky and silence. I can't, Lot said. The angel's eyes narrowed. The mountains are too far, Lot continued quickly, the words tumbling out. I'll never make it. Please, look, there's a town. Zor. It's small, close. Let me go there instead. It's nothing really. Insignificant. Surely you can spare it. The angel stared at him, and in that moment, Lot saw something flicker across the angel's face. Not anger, disappointment. Like watching a man choose a smaller cage instead of freedom. But the angel nodded. Very well, hurry. I can do nothing until you reach it. Lot ran, his wife beside him, his daughters behind, feet pounding dirt roads as the sky began to change color. Not the soft pink of normal dawn, something else. Orange bleeding into red, the air thickening, getting heavier. Birds scattered from trees flying west in panicked clouds. Animals bolted from the fields, instinct screaming at them to move, move, move. And behind them, Sodom woke to its last morning. People stepping into streets, merchants opening shops, bakers lighting ovens, going through the motions of a normal day, because yesterday was normal, and the day before, and the day before that. Why would today be different? Lot's lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he kept running because the angel's words echoed in his skull. I can do nothing until you reach it, which meant whatever was coming was already in motion, already descending, just waiting for one man to clear the blast radius before it fell. The gate of Zor appeared ahead, small, insignificant, exactly as Lot had said. He staggered through it, collapsed against a wall, gasping for air. His daughters bent over, hands on knees. His wife turned and looked back towards Sodom. Don't, Lot rasped. He said don't. But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the city where her home was, where her life had been, where her sons-in-law still slept, unaware. And in that moment, Lot saw her make the same choice he'd almost made. Her heart was still there. The sky split open, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, like something tore through the fabric of the atmosphere and fire poured out. Genesis 19:24 describes it in 5 words. The Lord rained on Sodom, sulfur and fire, not lava, not lightning, something that fell from above, something that burned hotter than anything natural, something that turned stone to glass and flesh to ash in seconds. Lot threw his arm over his face, the heat hitting like a wall even from this distance. The roar was deafening, the light blinding, and when he lowered his arm, Sodom was gone, not burning, not collapsing, gone. Replaced by a column of black smoke rising into the sky like a fist. Lot turned to his wife to pull her inside, to shield her from the sight. But she wasn't moving. She stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth open, hand outstretched toward the city she'd loved more than survival. No, Lot whispered. Her skin was changing, crystallizing, hardening, from her feet upward, like water freezing in reverse. No! He reached for her. Too late. She stood there, a statue, salt and stone, eyes still fixed on Sodom, heart still reaching back, and Lot finally understood the cost of hesitation. The world ended at sunrise. Lot stood at the edge of Zor, staring at the pillar of his wife. Her face locked in that final expression. Longing, grief. Her hand still reaching toward a city that no longer existed. His daughters were screaming, pulling at his arms. Father, Father, we have to move! But Lot couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His wife was stone. His sons-in-law were ash. Everything he'd built, everyone he'd known, gone in the span of a single breath. The angel's voice echoed in his memory. Don't look back. She'd looked, and the looking had killed her. Not the fire, not the sulfur. The choice, the refusal to let go. The heart that stayed tethered to a burning city even as her feet ran away from it. Jesus would reference this moment centuries later. Luke 17:32. 3 words. Remember Lot's wife. Not as a warning about disobedience, as a warning about desire, about what happens when your treasure is in the wrong place and you can't walk away even when the ground is crumbling beneath you. Lot's daughters dragged him inside the walls of Zoar. The town was in chaos, people running, shouting, pointing at the sky where the smoke column rose higher and higher, blotting out the sun. From the rooftops they could see it. The valley, lush and green just yesterday, was now a wasteland. Fire still falling in distant streaks. The air thick with ash. The smell, sulfur, and something worse. Something that made people gag and cover their mouths. 5 cities gone. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. All erased in minutes. Only Zoar remained. A tiny town spared not because it was righteous, but because one man had begged for it, had asked for a smaller compromise, a safer cage. And even now, standing in the middle of it, Lot felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him. He'd been given mountains, freedom, a clean break from everything Sodom represented. And he'd asked for Zoar instead, a place close enough to see the smoke, close enough to remember, close enough to keep one foot still planted in the valley even as it burned. Genesis 19:27-28 records what happened next. Abraham, miles away in the hills, got up early that morning and looked toward Sodom, toward the place he'd interceded for, the place he'd begged God to spare if even 10 righteous could be found. And he saw the smoke rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace. The text doesn't say what Abraham felt in that moment, doesn't record whether he wept or prayed or stood in silence, just says he looked and saw and knew the count had come up empty. The intercession had failed, not because God was unwilling to save, but because there was no one left worth saving, except Lot. And even Lot had hesitated. Days passed, maybe weeks. Lot stayed in Zoar, but the fear never left. Every time the ground trembled, and it did, aftershocks rippling through the valley, he thought the fire was coming back. Every time he smelled sulfur on the wind, he grabbed his daughters and ran for the door. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The town felt wrong. The people looked at him like he'd brought the curse with him, whispered that he was the reason the valley burned, that his God was a God of destruction, and they wanted no part of it. Genesis 19:30 says it plainly. Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the caves of the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. Afraid. Even in the town he'd begged to be spared, because safety wasn't about walls or distance. It was about where your heart could rest. And Lot's heart had died with his wife on the road. So he ran again, not towards something, just away, into the mountains he'd refused the first time, into caves where no one could find him, where he could hide from the world and from the God who'd saved him when he didn't deserve it. And in that darkness, Lot finally stopped running. But the cost of Sodom wasn't finished with him yet. The fire didn't rise from the earth. It fell. Genesis 19:24 is precise. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Not a volcano, not an earthquake that split the ground and released magma. Something descended from above. Something hot enough to melt stone into glass, hot enough to vaporize human bodies before they could scream. Archaeologists have found evidence in the region. Layers of ash mixed with sulfur. circular impact patterns, structures that show signs of extreme heat applied suddenly from above, not gradually from below. The cities didn't burn slowly. They were consumed in moments. 1 second, merchants were opening their shops. Mothers were nursing children. Men were laughing over wine from the night before. The next, the sky opened. Witnesses from surrounding areas, those who survived, described it later in fragments passed down through oral tradition. A sound like thunder, but wrong, continuous, growing louder, the sky turning colors that shouldn't exist, red bleeding into black, the air itself shimmering like it was melting. Then the first impact, not one massive strike, hundreds, thousands, balls of burning sulfur falling like rain, each one exploding on contact, stone shattering, wood igniting instantly, flesh erased. The texts suggest it wasn't random, wasn't scattered. The fire fell on 5 cities with surgical precision: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, Bela. Everything inside the target zone, obliterated. Everything outside, untouched. Zor, just miles away, stood unharmed. Not because it was better, because one man had asked and heaven had agreed. But the 5 cities, no mercy, no reprieve, no time to reconsider or repent. The heat was unimaginable. Modern estimates suggest temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn sand into glass, hot enough to reduce bone to powder. Lot's wife didn't burn. She crystallized. Salt deposits in the region support the possibility. Extreme heat combined with sulfur compounds could have created a chemical reaction that encased her body in mineral layers within seconds. She became a monument, a warning carved in salt and stone. But Sodom? Sodom became a memory. The walls collapsed inward. The gates melted. The streets where Lot had walked for years, where he'd made deals, built wealth, turned a blind eye to suffering, were buried under layers of ash and sulfur, so thick that nothing would grow there for generations. Deuteronomy 29:23 describes the aftermath. The whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown, nothing growing, no vegetation sprouting. A scar on the earth, permanent, irreversible. The smoke rose for days. Abraham saw it from his camp in the hills. A black column reaching into the sky, visible for miles. The smell carried on the wind, sulfur, ash, death. He'd pleaded for those cities, bargained with God. What if there are 50 righteous, 40, 30, and God had agreed? For 10, the cities would be spared. But there weren't 10. There weren't 5. There was Lot. And Lot had hesitated. Genesis 19:29 offers one line of grace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Remembered Abraham. Not Lot's righteousness, not Lot's faith. Abraham's intercession, Abraham's prayer. Grace extended to a man who didn't deserve it, through a relationship he hadn't earned. The question everyone asks, why? Why such complete destruction? Why not a warning? Why not a chance to evacuate? Why erase 5 cities and thousands of lives in a single morning? The texts suggest an answer, though it's uncomfortable. Some things, once they reach a certain point, cannot be reformed, can only be removed. Sodom wasn't destroyed for a single sin. It was destroyed for a culture that had normalized cruelty. That had made oppression profitable. That had turned abundance into a weapon against the vulnerable. Jude 1-7 references it. Sodom and Gomorrah serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. An example, not just judgment. A warning written in ash and salt for every generation that followed. That prosperity without justice is suicide. That strength without mercy is death. That when a society stops seeing people as human, heaven stops seeing that society as salvageable. And in the end, fire answered. Not because God is cruel, because some cancers, left unchecked, spread. Sodom had become a cancer, and the valley had run out of time. The fire fell, and when the smoke cleared, nothing remained but silence and salt. She stopped. That's all it took. One moment of hesitation, one glance backward, 1 second where her feet kept moving, but her heart stayed behind. And she became stone. Genesis 19:26 records it without drama. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. No explanation, no details, just the fact. She looked. She changed. She stopped being a person and became a monument. The question isn't what happened to her body. The question is why she looked in the first place. The angel's command had been clear. Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the mountains. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. But she looked anyway. Not because she didn't hear, not because she forgot, because everything she loved was behind her. Her home, her friends, her sons-in-law still sleeping in beds she'd made for them. Her life. Running meant abandoning all of it. And some part of her, maybe the same part that had made Lot hesitate at his own door, couldn't let go. So she turned her head, just for a second, just to see. And the seeing killed her. Jesus referenced this moment in Luke 17. He's talking about the end times, about the day when judgment comes suddenly and people are caught unprepared. He says, remember Lot's wife, not remember Sodom's destruction, not remember the angels. Remember the woman who ran but couldn't stop loving what she was running from. Because that's the real danger. Not the fire outside, the attachment inside. Lot's wife died free, physically. She was outside the blast zone, safe. Saved by proximity to a righteous man and an interceding uncle she'd never met. But her heart, still in Sodom. And when your heart is in the wrong place, geography doesn't matter. The pillar stood for years. Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote in the 1st century that it was still visible in his time. Travellers would pass it on the road and point. Parents would tell their children the story. That's what happens when you love the wrong things more than life. Whether it was literally her body preserved in salt, or a natural formation that became associated with the story, the point remained. Some choices crystallize you, lock you in place, turn you into a warning for everyone who comes after. She could have had the mountains, fresh air, a new start, freedom from the rot she'd lived with for years. But she wanted Sodom more, and Sodom was gone. What did she see in that final glance? The texts don't say, but the imagination fills in the gaps. Maybe she saw the fire falling, the city she'd called home collapsing into ash, the streets where she'd walked, the markets where she'd shopped, the gates where Lot had sat. All of it disappearing in seconds. Maybe she saw her sons-in-law, the men who'd laughed at Lot's warning, who'd chosen sleep over survival. Did she watch them die? Did she see the moment the fire reached them? Or maybe she didn't see anything at all. Maybe the act of turning was enough. The refusal to obey. The choice to prioritize sentiment over survival. Either way, it ended her. Lot kept running. He didn't stop. Didn't turn around to check on her. Because he'd heard the command too. And somewhere in his chest he knew. If he looked, he'd join her. So he ran. Left her standing there. A statue with eyes forever fixed on a city that no longer existed. Later, hours, maybe days, he must have realized she wasn't behind him anymore. Must have known what happened. must have felt the weight of it. His wife, gone, not to fire, to longing. And the worst part? He understood, because he'd felt the same pull, the same hesitation, the same desperate desire to cling to what was burning. The only difference, the angels had dragged him out before he could stop himself. She'd been behind him, outside their reach. And when the moment came, she chose the past over the future, and the past turned her to salt. Abraham woke before dawn. Something pulled him from sleep. Not a sound, not a dream, just a feeling in his chest like the air had changed weight. He walked to the edge of the hills overlooking the valley, the place where he'd stood with God weeks earlier, bargaining for cities he'd never lived in, pleading for people he'd never met. What if there are 50 righteous? 40? 30? 20? 10? And God had agreed. For 10, the cities would be spared. Abraham looked east, toward Sodom, toward the valley where his nephew had chosen to build a life, and saw hell on earth. Genesis 19:28 describes it. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley, and he saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. Not a campfire, not a burning building, a furnace, industrial, total, the kind of smoke that rises when everything, stone, wood, flesh, bone, is being consumed at once. The column stretched into the sky, black and thick, blotting out the stars that were just beginning to fade with morning light. Abraham stood there, silent, watching the place where Lot had lived, where thousands had built homes and lives and futures, reduced to ash. The text doesn't say he cried, doesn't say he prayed, just says he looked. Sometimes there are no words, just witness. The valley was gone, not burning, not smoldering, gone, transformed into something unrecognizable. What had been green and fertile yesterday was now grey and dead. The rivers that had made Lot choose this place, those rivers that Genesis compared to the Garden of Eden, were choked with ash and sulfur. Nothing grew, nothing moved. The birds that used to fill the air at sunrise, silent. The herds that grazed in the fields, vapor. Deuteronomy would later describe it as a warning to future generations. The whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown, nothing sprouting, no vegetation of any kind. A scar, permanent, visible for anyone who passed through the region for centuries to come. This is what judgment looks like. Not a theological concept, not a metaphor. Actual, physical, irreversible destruction. Abraham thought about the conversation he'd had with God. He'd pushed hard, reduced the number from 50 to 10. Surely, in 5 cities with thousands of people, there would be 10 worth saving. But there weren't. Or maybe there were, and they'd left, or died, or compromised so completely they no longer counted as righteous. Either way, the count had come up empty. And the mercy Abraham had pleaded for had found no one to land on except Lot. Genesis 19:29 explains, "So it was that, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow." Remembered Abraham, not Lot. Abraham's prayer, Abraham's intercession, Abraham's relationship with God. Lot had been saved by proximity to grace he hadn't earned. The smoke rose for days. Travelers approaching from the east saw it from miles away and changed their routes. Merchants who'd planned to trade in Sodom diverted to other cities, spreading the news. The valley is gone. All of it. Don't go there. The story spread, mutated, grew with each retelling. Some said it was divine wrath. Others said the earth had split open. Still others whispered about angels. and fire from the sky, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something unnatural had happened, something that defied explanation. And in the silence that followed, one question echoed across the region. Could it happen again? Lot sat in a cave, staring at nothing. His daughters huddled in the corner, traumatized. His wife was a pillar of salt somewhere on the road behind them. His sons-in-law were ash. His house was rubble. His name, the reputation he'd built over years, was attached to the city that no longer existed. He'd been dragged out, saved, rescued. But rescue doesn't feel like victory when you've lost everything. Abraham had tried to save the cities, had pleaded with God, had stood in the gap. But Lot had just survived. By accident, by association, by the skin of his teeth. And now, sitting in the darkness of a mountain cave, he realized the cruelest truth of all. You can escape a burning city, but you can't escape what that city did to you. Sodom was gone, but Sodom was still inside him, and the real destruction was just beginning. Genesis 19:30 is brutal in its simplicity. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. Afraid. Even in the town he'd begged to spare. Even in the one place the fire hadn't touched. Because fear wasn't about safety anymore. It was about what he'd seen, what he'd lost, what he knew could happen again if heaven decided the count wasn't finished. So Lot climbed, away from people, away from cities, away from anything that reminded him of what he used to be. He found a cave in the mountains and disappeared inside. His daughters followed, because where else could they go? Their mother was gone. Their fiancés were ash. The world they'd known had been erased in a single morning. All they had left was their father. And he was broken. The cave was cold, dark, silent except for the wind that howled through the entrance at night. No servants, no wealth, no gate where Lot could sit and be respected. Just stone walls and the smell of damp earth, and the slow realization that survival wasn't the same as living. Lot sat against the back wall, staring at nothing. Days blurred together. He stopped speaking, stopped eating unless his daughters forced food into his hands, stopped doing anything except reliving the moment he'd hesitated at his own door. If he'd left faster, if he'd convinced his sons-in-law, if his wife hadn't looked back. The ifs piled up like stones burying him. His daughters whispered to each other in the darkness, watched their father fade, watched hope drain from his eyes, and realized with cold clarity they were alone, isolated in the mountains with a traumatized man who could barely function. What happened next is recorded in Genesis 19:31-38. The older daughter spoke, "Our father is old, and there is no man around to marry us in the normal way. Let us preserve our family line through our father." The logic was born from desperation, from isolation, from years of living in a city where moral boundaries had been erased. They'd learned survival in Sodom. And now, trapped in a cave, those lessons surfaced in the darkest possible way. The text records that wine was involved, that Lot was unaware of what transpired, that 2 sons were conceived, Moab and Ben-Ami, who would become the fathers of nations that plagued Israel for generations. The Bible doesn't celebrate this, doesn't justify it, just records it as historical fact. A tragedy compounding tragedy. Trauma breeding more trauma in the darkness of a cave where a broken family tried to survive the aftermath of divine judgment. Lot never returned to civilization. The man who'd sat at the gate of Sodom, who'd built wealth and influence, who'd been somebody, faded into obscurity. The Bible doesn't record his death, doesn't memorialize him, just stops mentioning him after the cave. He disappears from the narrative like smoke. But the consequences of his choices lived on. Moab, Ammon, nations born from desperation, nations that would war against Israel, nations that traced their origin back to a cave where everything went wrong. Peter would later call him righteous Lot in 2 Peter 2-7. A man tormented by the wickedness around him, a man who suffered. But righteousness doesn't erase consequences, doesn't undo the cost of years spent in Sodom, doesn't bring back the wife who looked back, or restore the daughters who'd been shaped by a corrupt culture. The cave stayed empty after he died. Wind and rain eventually wore down the entrance. Dirt covered the floor. Time erased the physical evidence, but the story remained, passed down through generations, not as a celebration, as a warning that you can escape a burning city and still carry its poison with you, that physical rescue doesn't guarantee emotional or spiritual restoration, that the patterns learned in darkness don't disappear just because you've moved to a new location. Lot got out, but Sodom's influence never left his family. It shaped his daughter's understanding of survival. It defined their choices in the cave. It created bloodlines that would oppose God's people for centuries. The destruction of Sodom didn't end when the fire stopped falling. It echoed, rippled, continued in ways no one could have predicted. Lot was saved. But saving isn't the same as thriving. Rescue isn't restoration. Survival isn't healing. He'd been pulled from the flames by angels, saved by Abraham's intercession, given a second chance at life. But he spent that life hiding in a cave, broken, traumatized, unable to rebuild, unable to move forward. Because some scars go deeper than fire can burn. Lot escaped Sodom, but Sodom never escaped him. And in the darkness of that cave, the real cost of his choices became clear. The Dead Sea sits where Sodom used to stand, the lowest point on earth. A body of water so saturated with salt that nothing can live in it. No fish, no plants, no movement except the slow evaporation under a relentless sun. Tourists visit the shores today, float in water that holds them up like hands, take pictures, rub mud on their skin, laugh. Few of them know they're standing on a graveyard. Archaeologists have found evidence in the region. Circular burn patterns, layers of ash mixed with sulfur, settlements that show signs of sudden catastrophic destruction around the time Genesis places the event. Bab Edra, Numera, ancient cities buried under centuries of sediment and salt. Cities that ended violently, abruptly, with no signs of gradual decline or invasion, just termination. The valley remembers, even if the people who walked through it don't. The story of Sodom became a reference point. Isaiah used it, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jesus himself. Whenever the prophets wanted to describe total judgment, complete destruction, the end of something that had gone too far, they pointed to Sodom, like Sodom and Gomorrah. 4 words that carried the weight of annihilation. But here's what's interesting. They didn't reference it to celebrate destruction. They referenced it as a warning. Ezekiel 16:49 names Sodom's sin clearly. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Not sexual immorality alone, not violence alone. The combination. Wealth turned inward, strength used to crush instead of protect, abundance that bred cruelty. A society that stopped seeing people as human. And when that happened, heaven responded. The question isn't whether Sodom deserved judgment. The texts make that clear. The outcry was great. The sin was grave. The count came up empty. The question is, what makes a place cross the line from redeemable to irreversible? How does a city go from prosperous to obliterated in the span of a single night? The answer, buried in the narrative, is this: slowly. Then, all at once. Sodom didn't become Sodom overnight. It was years of small compromises, daily choices to prioritize comfort over conscience. Moments when good people like Lot, saw evil and said nothing because speaking up cost too much. The rot spread, normalized, became culture, and by the time anyone realized how far it had gone, it was too late to stop. The angels didn't arrive to give Sodom one more chance. They arrived to see if there was anyone left worth pulling out before the fire fell. Lot survived, but survival came at a cost. His wife, his sons-in-law, his home, his identity, everything he'd built over decades, gone. And even after escaping, he carried Sodom with him, in his hesitation, in his fear, in the cave where he hid from a world that no longer made sense. Rescue doesn't erase trauma. Salvation doesn't undo consequences. Lot was called righteous. But righteousness in a corrupt system still leaves scars. The real tragedy isn't that Sodom burned. It's that Lot stayed as long as he did. That he built a life in a place he knew was wrong. That he told himself he could live with it, until the cost became unbearable. Jesus referenced Lot's wife in Luke 17. He's talking about the end times, about how people will be living normal lives, eating, drinking, buying, selling, right up until the moment judgment arrives. And he says, remember Lot's wife. Not a warning about fire, a warning about attachment, about loving the wrong thing so much that even when you're running for your life, you can't stop looking back. Because the real danger isn't the fire outside, it's the longing inside, the refusal to let go, the heart that stays tethered to what's burning. Physical distance means nothing if your soul is still chained to Sodom. The valley is quiet now. The smoke cleared centuries ago. The cities are dust. The people who lived and died there, forgotten by everyone except the God who counted them. But the question remains. The same question Abraham asked on the ridge. The same question Lot faced at his door. The same question every generation has to answer when comfort collides with conscience. How far is too far? When does prosperity become poison? When does silence become complicity? When does a society cross the line from broken to beyond repair? And the harder question, the one that sits in the chest like a stone, if the angels walked into your city tonight, if they came to count the righteous before the fire fell, would you hear the warning in time? Or would you hesitate, just like Lot?